So our first panelist, Crystal Abidin, who's at the University of Western Australia, is joining us via Skype. Hi.
Hi everyone.
And then we will have, instead of Shelley Cobb, who couldn't make it today, Jennifer Clark from Fordham University. And finally, Helen Warner from the University of East Anglia. So we'll do the three presentations and have some time for discussion, and hopefully Crystal can hang around for that too, but whatever works for you. So with that, I will give it to Crystal.
Okay, I'm just going to get your presentation up.
Okay.
And then you give me the signal like you want to as well.
Sure.
Okay, we're staring at your title now.
How's the volume? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to speak slowly so that the internet gods maintain our connection. Hi everyone. I'm a big fan of alliteration, but I should have thought through my title because I can't say it very quick. My talk for today is Screens, Dreams, Scenes, and Screams, and I'm going to talk to you about a group of women I call social media micro-celebrity who perform very gendered labor in the Singaporean context. So the next slide, you see my giant face? That's me. My name is Crystal. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in Anthropology, Sociology, Communications, and New Media. And the main way I conducted this piece of research was through web archaeology, that is tracing how these women did their work online. I also did personal interviews, sometimes through Skype, sometimes through text messaging. Some of the women preferred to have their interviews via text or Twitter, and I did that. But the bulk of the interviews took place face-to-face. And the main bulk of my methodology was participant observation, where I got to spend up to a year with these women in the flesh. So next slide. These are social media micro-celebrities. You will soon see many pictures of them. They're largely between the ages of 15 to 35. They're mainly women, although they are men, but they're a very small minority. And they engage in very feminized modes of interaction, such as producing envy, aspiration, and relationality. In the next slide, you will see a picture of a woman, a blonde woman, pink background. This is a typical blogmas of these micro-celebrities. This particular blogger is called Xia Xue. That's her blogmas. On the bottom left, you see her live Instagram feed, and on the bottom right, her live YouTube feed that rotates. Next slide. Now, she usually writes about the very mundane things in life. However, this gained her a very strong following since she started this endeavor in 2005. So while she began on blogs, she eventually moved on to Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, any social media at all, you name it, they're on it. And as a result of this really high readership, clients have been clamoring to them to sign them up for editorials. Editorial is basically a pastiche of the word editorial and advertisements, where these bloggers have to craft very personalized narratives of these products. For instance, when she got married, everything from her gifts to the venue to the food to a gown was entirely sponsored. In exchange, she had to put up these sponsored logos on her blog for up to 6 months. Next slide. This shifted on into deeper and deeper forms of sponsorship, such as when she moved into her first home. The entire renovations for her house, worth more than $100,000, was entirely covered by various sponsors, and in exchange she had to produce a live vlog and several blog posts to advertise for them. Next slide. So you get married, you move into a house, and then you have a baby. Before her baby was born, Xia Xue's fetus amassed up to $25,000 worth of endorsements, ranging from things like diaper brand endorsements to nappy cream. The picture you see on the right, with the man in the background, started out as a fan of hers from the US. They fell in love, did online dating for a while. He moved to Singapore, they moved in together, they got married. And this picture is particularly important for two reasons. The first, you can see that Xia Xue is looking very glamorous and very awake. Eyelashes and hair gel were sponsored. She was awake and conscious for the C-section that was filmed live in 3 parts, and it's on YouTube if you're interested, as part of an endorsement deal and as part of a web series that shows her guide to life for the past 5 or 6 years. This picture is the media public debut of her baby, affectionately known as Baby Dash. This was his first media appearance. In the next slide, you will see a few more pictures of his endorsement deals. So now celebrity and endorsements moving from mom to husband to baby. I really love the picture on the right because it's baby dash posing with a pink diaper and mom posing with a pink hair product, and they're both earning their own keep. Next slide. So, as he progressed to become a social media micro-celebrity himself, a lot of the endorsement deals that his mom got into involved him. This example, where he's shown with very stylish hair, went viral on Instagram. And as a result, his mom was able to market this, selling decals, phone covers, t-shirts with her son's face on it. Remember that since he was a fetus, he had already amassed a large following of people who were excited to find out who he was. So mom kind of played with this trope about a mother who's providing the best for her child, but also kind of milking his web presence in order to sell this. So here, this car is part of an endorsement deal. She gets to drive it for a year. She gets to do this for 3 years with 3 cars. And of course, they got sponsors to put Pineapple Dash on the car. If you see this in the street, take a selfie with it, put in the right hashtag, and you may win sponsored products from her advertisers. The last picture on the next slide, you see Baby Dash. This picture is probably 6 weeks old. It was most recently a face-to-face event held in conjunction with his second birthday, where mothers could come down to talk about baby products that Xiaoxue was endorsing. However, the bulk of the crowd that went down to see this micro baby celebrity in the flesh were actually teenage girls and boys, young fathers, young mothers, and even secondary school, high school kids who were fans of his. So although a lot of this interaction that I've shown you, it takes place mostly online, these micro-celebrities actually meet with their fans face-to-face very often. Some of it is very informal, say meeting up at Starbucks at 6 p.m. on a Saturday to take selfies. Some of it's very extravagant, like this case, where sponsors are involved every stage. In the next slide, I want to briefly talk to you about 2 concepts I use in this paper with regards to emotion work. The first draws from Teresa Sand, who coined the concept of micro-celebrity. She used this in the context of early 2000s American cam girls who were providing pictures of their personal lives on the web as lived. Now, these cam girls and micro-celebrity basically end up their popularity using, back then, computer devices like forums, but today, social media platforms. They are also very famous, but only to a small niche audience who seems to have a very in-depth understanding of their work. And unlike Hollywood celebrities who don't want you to see them coming out of the gym or looking at the glamorous, these women are out there and they want you to be responsive as opposed to keeping the distance. The second concept that's very befitting is whose child's work on emotional labor. Simply put, a lot of the labor that these women engage in turns emotions into something with use value and exchange value. And specifically, they have to create these publicly observable bodily reactions to how much they love their fans, or love their child, or love their partners in order to market some products. So there's this cognitive, bodily, and expressive emotion work that the women engage in order to look believable to their audience. In the next slide, this is an archive of a couple hashtag between an influencer Shirley and her partner Yao, so hashtag YaoShe. It shows her visualizing romance on the internet between her and her partner, and this effect can be commodified for them to sell lots of couple products to her following. In the next slide, you see another influencer, Melissa, who's posing for a photo shoot. Now again, these micro-celebrities are hinged upon showing you behind the scenes of real life, interspersed with high glamour shots. So while she shows you the high fashion shoot, she also shows you behind the scenes in order to draw her audiences in as if they were really intimate. And in the next slide, I learned a very, very hard way that typing K full stop is not the way to reply any text message at all, because I once did that with the influencers, with the micro-celebrities I was going to meet, and they freaked out, thinking I was really angry with them because I failed to put in emoji, flashing GIFs into my response. So this emotional work also comes through in textual work, in the ways they produce girl talk with each other. So I'll now move on to the next slide. The 4 main ways that I categorize these women producing very gendered feminine types of labor. The first is behind the screens with regards to technology. In the next slide, You see a group of influencers holding out a lot of cameras and phones. This is a typical micro-celebrity party that I got to attend during fieldwork. Now you will see that all these people seem to be in the midst of a party, but they're very attached to technology. And the micro-celebrities tell me they feel this sense that wherever they go, they need to keep connected with technology, especially with Wi-Fi, with connectivity, and with battery life. So the first thing, battery life is something they can control, and for this reason, a lot of the women walk around with power banks, sometimes up to 3 power banks. Some of them walk into cafes and ask if there is a PowerPoint they can sit next to, as opposed to asking for the menu. Sometimes a lot of these women also experience anxiety, so if their battery life drops below 90%, they immediately want to charge their phones up. Battery life seems to be the thing that they can control. The second thing is Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi you can control to a certain degree. A lot of these women have been involved in very exotic cruises or far-flung locations that sponsors want to bring them to, but have rejected all of these once they find out that on some island or some cruise, they're not going to be able to have Wi-Fi for a set period of days. So when they travel abroad, the first thing they do is usually get a Wi-Fi dongle or Wi-Fi egg in order to be connected 24/7. The third thing that you really cannot really control is connectivity. You can have maximum Wi-Fi, you can have the best battery life, but if Twitter or Instagram chooses to fail on you, there's nothing much you can do, and that's something they have to wait out. In the next slide, you see another 4 influencers in the middle of a shopping mall, and they're promoting some makeup products live to an audience, to the readers who have come down to see them. Now, what the audiences don't see is that these women were meant to be putting up live Instagram updates of their event, but the Wi-Fi reception in the shopping mall was horrendous. So what they had to do in their tiny dresses and their heels is to take good pictures, edit them, put filters, run out of the mall, try to get Wi-Fi in the sky, upload the photo, come back to the mall, and then repeat this every 30 to 40 minutes because that was the agreement with the sponsor on how often they had to put these live updates out. So this is a lot of labor that's not seen usually when you look at them just online. The next slide. Second category, micro-celebrities and their fandom, or more specifically, their following. Next slide. This is a screenshot of how one micro-celebrity has been responding to a Twitter fans in the span of 5 minutes. This is how quick they type right now. So unlike a lot of celebrities on Twitter who only selectively respond to some people, micro-celebrities claim they try their best to respond to everyone in order to maintain this illusion of intimacy that they have. And of course, a lot of this is clouded in terms of endearment and girl talk. In the next slide, you see a micro-celebrity on the left and 3 customers who approached her in a clothing store where she was engaged to walk around for 2 hours and give out fashion advice. Now this was very interesting because even though she's never met them before, there was a lot of girl talk happening, like, hey babe, oh you look so great, oh miss you so much, let's keep in touch and let's hang in there. And of course, none of that really happens. But this girl talk comes about so naturally in the way that they engage with their followers in order to maintain intimacy. Next slide. Third category, micro-celebrities and their peers, or more specifically, basically their fellow competition. In the next slide, you see a micro-celebrity holding up a camera in pink. I had the privilege of shadowing her to an exclusive bloggers party that was only featuring top micro-celebrity bloggers and fan base that had to win contests to attend. So in this setting here, there's a mixture of top micro-celebrities, CD-grade micro-celebrities, and their fans. And I found out that not all micro-celebrities tended to be able to speak with each other, even though they look like great friends in real life on pictures. In the next slide, I'm that person on the left awkwardly in purple glasses. I got accidentally roped into this picture, but you can't tell, even though they all look very friendly, that it was a very difficult 3-hour endeavor trying to get this picture taken. The reason being, the women in the front row were the more high-profile micro-celebrities and the ones in the back were considered lower down the rank. And even though they wanted to be in the scene, be in the know, to look like they were in the height of activity, they felt like they couldn't bridge this gap because they had different statuses based on how big or how small your following is. They would say things like, oh, I can sit with her, she's got 10,000 followers, I'm only in the 5K range. Or I can sit at a page, she's got 100,000 followers, I'm only at 20K. And that was the way they demarcated themselves in terms of status, which was very interesting to me because I couldn't see this just from my online observations until I met them. Also, what you don't see is a lot of conflict. Sometimes these girls aren't really friends. They may be vying for the same readers, vying for the same clients, but in order to maintain the illusion of homosocial girl talk and girl affect that you're having fun together at a party, these things are hidden from the scene and you don't see them in pictures. Next slide, the final category, we look at micro-celebrities and back-end actors. Here's where they really express emotional frustrations that you don't see anywhere else unless you belong to the privileged inner circle. In the next slide, these back-end actors usually comprise friends, families, most of the time boyfriends or blog managers. So a lot of these women are so high profile that they're managed by talent agencies, much like modern modeling agencies that help to broker their deals. This is my hand helping to take a picture of an influencer with a model that he saw at a special event, and taking photos is so much work. What you don't see is the influencer shouting out commands going, tilt the camera, get better lighting, put the phone lower so my legs look longer, or make sure it's bright enough so I can put in some filter. And this sometimes causes a strain with the relationship between them and their boyfriends, as a lot of them have said to me. In the final picture, I happen to be a shadow blog manager at this particular event where about a dozen micro-celebrities got to watch Dirty Dancing as a preview musical and then go for a 1-hour tour behind the scenes backstage. There was a small source of frustration in that there was no Wi-Fi. Secondly, they weren't really sure what details they had to record because every event they attend, though it looks very glamorous and fun, they have to meticulously record with their phones the key details such as sponsor names, names of dishes, prices of dishes, locations, bus routes to give the maximum detail for the material they're producing. So as a manager, I was there to provide them with emotional support. Sometimes they were very hesitant to speak to the client directly, like these producers here, to ask them questions. So I really had to read for their facial expressions if they looked lost and interject to ask for some clarification, just to make sure that all the influencers put out the right information for vetting before it goes live. So last slide, this has been me, screens, streams, scenes, and screams, looking at micro-celebrity, affect, and emotional labor with technology, with the fan base, with fellow competition with other micro-celebrities, and with the back-end actors such as their boyfriends, family, and managers. And that's all. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks very much, Crystal. I'm not sure if it's easy for you to hang around, if you'd like to hang around for the rest of the panel.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to.
Okay, so then next we'll hear from Jennifer Clark.
I don't know if you all heard the announcement, but I'm not Shelley Cobb. I'm not using Shelley Cobb. I'm really sad about that in a lot of ways. But my presentation is about the Lear factory, which is Tandem Productions, and the feminist labor involved in that in the American television industry in the 1970s. Sure you can't see that?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
That's okay, that's fine. Sorry,
Let's get to the phone.
so you sit there.
Should
Great, okay. So the Lear factory is a term that Mike Wallace used in 1976. This is the origin of the term as far as I can find it. During 60 Minutes profile of producer Norman Lear. I'm going to show you a brief clip from the interview. And in this clip, you're going to see the use of the factory concept to compare Lear's values to those of the television industry he claimed to challenge. So let's take a look at that.
Everybody's in the business of improving last year's profits.
The Lear factory is in the business of improving last year's profits. Well, you were doing 1 and then 2 and then 5, and Now you're doing 7 shows and you're turning out 3 more pilots. You're selling T-shirts and hats and
I'm not selling any of those things. And that Lear factory, each show, as you well observed, is staffed by the best writers, the best producers, the best directors, the best actors, the best in this town.
So in this clip, this sort of back and forth is followed by some more discussion about this. Wallace goes on to describe Lear as a foreman who spots problems and solves them fast because time is money. Lear hated this idea. He really resisted the notion of his company as a factory. And I think in part because it ruined a brand potentially for him. And I think he had a genuine investment in valuing workers. So the Lear factory renders all other workers besides Lear invisible and envisions them as cogs in a machine that's overseen by Lear. As we see in the clip, Lear countered his ideas about the factory by emphasizing the quality of his staff, the, quote, best in this town. Lear, of course, has been credited with a number of groundbreaking television programs and credited with reinventing the business practices of American television during the 1970s. And so this is just a kind of a highlight of what was happening in Tandem Productions in the 1970s. Lear's programs achieved, as Kirsten Lentz describes it, legendary status through various controversial themes. Lear hired in keeping with his leftist leanings, which in part meant liberal workers were hired because they enriched the distinctive output of Tandem, Lear's company. With the growing visibility of feminism in the 1970s, Tandem offered women new and unusual opportunities, more so than with the development of Mary Hartman. In the show's press kit, Lear describes Mary Hartman as, quote, simply taking a look at our life and times through another kind of prism. He expands on this innocuous description with a more unsettling one. Of course, the prism may appear to have been fashioned by a drunken lens maker in a darkly wooded German forest. Lear used both the perversity of the show and the talent of its production staff to promote the show and to shepherd it through multiple obstacles in getting it to air. I think it's tempting to credit Lear and center him as showrunner and creative talent that made programming like Mary Hartman possible. Even with her acknowledgement of the collective labors of television production, Aaron Lee Mock maintains that Mary Hartman could only have existed due to the, quote, stewardship of Lear, whose prominence in history of genre play prepared him to create this unique program and prepared viewers to accept it. In spite of this mystification of labor through the remarkable individual, other workers, the drunken lens makers who created critical social commentary, played important roles in Tandem's success. One of the most notable things about Mary Hartman was the number of women involved in its production, and this is something that promotional materials repeatedly emphasized. Producer Viva Knight's career success proved that a woman's place is anywhere she has the desire and initiative for it to be. By publicizing the accomplishments of Tandem's female workers, the company could promote itself as a unique place where women could excel, and it also helped potential buyers of the program to envision the company and its product as groundbreaking. To Tandem's credit, many women did rapidly rise through its ranks, and their talents were recognized even as they worked in traditionally feminized, devalued jobs. To call upon producer Viva Knight again, only 2 years and 2 months after joining Tandem, she moved from working as a secretary to working as a producer. Her impressive performance on the job prompted Lear to, and this is promotional talk, break precedents and make Knight, who was not a writer, as would be expected, background for such a promotion, a producer. Knight was not alone in Mary Hartman's female-driven production staff. The other women who worked on the show included 3 out of 4 producers, 3 out of 7 writers, 1 out of 2 program consultants, 2 out of 4 creators, both of the costume designers, and the director of publicity. The cast featured Louise Lasser as protagonist Mary Hartman, and the project was further enhanced, again, language from promotion, when Joan Darling was hired as director. Women working in key production roles created a program and a workplace that made room for women's experiences. This formative relationship between worker and product is confirmed in writer Ann Marcus's interview with Ms. Magazine. In this interview, Marcus describes her creative skill in writing for the show as rooted in her own, quote, sense of the everyday absurd based on years of housewifely domesticity. As Marcus suggests, the production ethos of Mary Hartman validated women's gendered knowledge, and in doing so, retooled what counted as a contribution to show content and who could best bring insights into the development of a complex female protagonist. Mary Hartman featured Mary Hartman, a dissatisfied housewife living in Fernwood, Ohio, amidst a series of bizarre, dysfunctional, psychological and economic situations. The program employed the melodramatic conventions of a daytime soap opera, but magnified the tone and content of the genre. The story of a discontented, disturbed housewife facing a host of domestic problems, ranging from waxy yellow buildup on the kitchen floor, to serial killers, to her husband's erectile dysfunction. You can't really see this here, but Mary's making overtures to her husband while he's reading a gun handbook, a handgun magazine. And so he sort of refuses her sexual advances throughout. And it also includes serial killers, flashers, women's careers, so on and so forth. So all of this sort of the myriad dysfunction of this world provided Norman Lear with the material necessary to launch a substantively different type of programming, as well as a different type of selling it. So you can see here on TV Guide how Mary Hartman beat the system. This is a very typical headline about the kind of boldness with which the show and Lear was approaching the distribution and selling of television content in the American television industry at the time. After failing to sell Mary Hartman to the networks, Lear invited independent station owners to his house to pitch the show. As the story goes, a single station owner was so moved by Lear's passion that he stood up and offered to buy a 12-program contract for the show on the spot, and then the rest of the crowd quickly follows. Once on the air, Mary Hartman continued to challenge industry conventions. It successfully ran opposite the 11 o'clock news, and according to Stuart and Elizabeth Ewan, encouraged people to relinquish the paternalism of male news anchors. The show outperformed the evening news in all important urban areas of New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and prompted local stations to launch unconventional news programs of their own. In a 1976 issue of Socialist Revolution, Barbara Ehrenreich praised the show's revolutionary politics. We jolt from Mary musing about death to brisk homemakers competing in a paper towel wet strength contest. The contradiction is overpowering. Maybe the Waltons can sell granola, or Mary Tyler Moore can sell pantyhose, but how can Mary Hartman sell anything? In its fractured and increased multiples of storylines and characters, Mary Hartman deployed the strategies of soaps that trained women as domestic consumers and laborers under capitalism in order to comment on it. The show's soap operatic tendencies also had an impact on production. Production staff brought their expertise to the program in two ways, and these were women. Number one, they possessed a personal understanding of women's frustrations in domestic life, and two, as a result of sexism and hiring for more prestigious television production jobs, they often already had worked in soap operas. Lear faced problems bringing his vision of a soap opera satire to life because, in writer Anne Marcus's words, it had to have enough of a storyline going for it so that it would attract people on that level too. When she interviewed for the job, Marcus was working on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow. She, in her own words, didn't have a reputation as a top comedy writer, but she did win the job over a lot of male top comedy writers at the time who interviewed for the coveted position. Unlike these competitors, Marcus knew how to keep the story going with a lot of characters and intermingled stories. Marcus's background in soaps also provided her with a second advantage, working in a demanding production schedule. It was a chore, Marcus said, of soap opera writing. It was hard work, turning out 5 scripts a week, and she had to do this exact kind of work for a nighttime soap as well, and she was well prepared to do this kind of labor. Tandem went beyond hiring women in creative positions alone. It established its feminist credentials by hiring Virginia Carter in 1973. Carter was the former president of the Los Angeles chapter of NOW and a vocal public ERA advocate, Equal Rights Amendment. She also, at the time of her hire for Tandem, was curiously enough working as a research physicist at the Aerospace Corporation. Carter describes her value for Tandem through her feminist credentials alone. I understood that the only reason possible to explain my presence in television was my expertise in women's liberation. I could be very productive with this focus, supplying this deficiency. Television work at Tandem offered Carter opportunities that working in aerospace did not. It granted her decision-making power and respect, that had been denied her in scientific work that she talks about, and values her more clearly through her salary. So she was being paid $18,000 at aerospace. She was a little reluctant to start working in television, so she thought, I'll ask for an outrageous salary, I'll ask for $25,000, and I won't get the job, and I can just kind of be done with this whole thing. Lear gave her the $25,000 immediately. Carter remained political after she joined Tandem. When the Anti-Defamation League criticized Mary Hartman for being libelous and questionable in taste, especially towards Jews, as they pointed out, Carter arranged for screenings of the episode in question and a face-to-face meeting with the organization. Carter represented her actions in the press as a desire to understand political stakes and to educate people within the company to create more politically sensitive and improved content. When challenged about lack of equal opportunity for black workers at a 1976 National Association of Broadcasters meeting, Carter did little to refute the claim and instead described the industry as one that had practiced de facto segregation for a number of years. This frank appraisal did little to harm her career at Tandem. Less than a year after these comments, she was promoted to Vice President of Creative Affairs. When the women at Tandem left production work there, they took with them increased visibility and viability in the industry, which they used to explore even more explicitly feminist ideas. When Ann Marcus left Tandem, she created The Life and Times of Eddie Roberts, based on, in part, the reputation of Mary Hartman. Syndicator Metro Media offered a 13-week guarantee and 65 episodes, and Marcus's association was not lost on Columbia or Metro Media, where, in a variety piece on this, executives at both companies unabashedly referred to the success of Hartman when discussing what they had come to expect from Eddie Roberts. And just to briefly sort of cap this show, Eddie Roberts is a satirical exploration of gender. The protagonist, Roberts, was a professor whose sexual problems resulted in his wife leaving him to pursue her own dreams of a professional baseball career. One of the female colleagues wanted to use Roberts as a guinea pig for a new male contraceptive drug she was developing, and Roberts was up against sort of one spot for tenure against a female Latina paraplegic who was both his rival and one of his best friends. In spite of these fantastical storylines, the show was linked to Marcus's own aspirations. It had a lot of me in it, she said, including her desire to be a baseball player. Susan Harris, who wrote the famed two-part abortion episode of Maude, formed her own independent production company in 1976 and created the sitcom Faye. Faye featured a 40-year-old woman who underwent a divorce and returns to the work of works in a law firm after decades of marriage and child rearing. In the show, feminism was clearly expressed and called out by name in the show. Plot lines included the fight for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, a senior partner's misogyny in the law firm, the National Organization for Women is cited, and sexist practice of insurance company rates is discussed, as well as the use of the term Ms. Although a series essentially canceled by NBC before it aired, the show held great importance for those who worked on it. Harris understood the show as one that was ahead of its time and was different, a point of view shared by Lee Grant here, who played Faye. The failure of the show to both Harris and Grant was due to the early evening time slot family viewing hour, a practice adopted in 1975 to limit offensive content during primetime viewing. Grant felt the show would have hit the roof if it had been scheduled more appropriately. Faye was canceled abruptly, and when the cast showed up for work one morning, they were met by the sight of set furniture in the parking lot and were told of the cancellation by a stagehand. Grant was scheduled to appear on The Tonight Show that same day. In the Tonight Show interview, she literally gave the finger to the guy who canceled the show. When asked about the repercussions of her actions, she denied there were any and instead described the relief such an act gave her, basically flipping someone off on network television. It was so much better than pulling over to the side of the road and crying, she said. It was over in a very healthy, fun way. Grant's response signals an important theme of control, which also played out in Grant's emphatic attribution to Harris's control on set. In interviews, Grant corrected misperceptions that would detract from Harris's accomplishments, and these typically involve suggestions of unattributed creative influence of male production staff or discontent among the crew and cast. For instance, Alan Arkin directed the first episode, but Grant clearly delineated his contribution as director only, not as a wide-ranging creative force. Susan did all the writing, said Grant. When asked discuss her ability to revise scripts, Grant said that she was permitted to, but that she didn't want to because, as she said, Susan was a genius. I was just thrilled to have that kind of stuff she gave me to work with. So to conclude, in her history of the Screenwriters Guild, Miranda Banks points out that while Lear credited women with being the valued players in his company, a woman who worked in television typically was not leading it on set or in post-production. And to say that Tandem performed better than CBS or Fox in hiring women to write for them might be faint praise indeed. And you can see this sort of comparison here. So while Tandem's outperforming, it's still a pretty weak field. While acknowledging that many women working in TV carried out menial tasks and were often hired as script girls, I also wish to draw attention to the unexpected influence some women did have on production and how particular productions reflected feminine and feminist values, skills, and knowledge. My intention in exploring the Lear factory and workers is not to further canonize Norman Lear, nor to question his lack of feminist credentials to discredit his contribution to politically responsible television. Rather, I want to consider the output of Tandem's women workers and what it might have meant that feminists were working on TV at various levels of production. According to a survey they conducted in 1981, Variety found that women occupied respectable status in the executive and production ranks in TV. Tandem was a company used as evidence for this claim, with women working there as VP of Creative Affairs, VP of Business Affairs, Assistant Treasurer, Director of Tax, Director of Development, Producers, Director of Public Affairs, Director of Business Affairs, and VP of Media Affairs. It would be an overstatement to suggest that Tandem changed everything for women working in television, but working at Tandem did provide women opportunities for feminist expression and for placement in its ranks without conventional credentialing. Their employment in marginalized positions as secretaries, as writers for soap operas, or in unrelated industries proved less of a barrier and more of an asset, as did their feminist awareness. Variety's hopeful report in 1981 points to the not inconsequential outcomes of this awareness. The workplace experiences and triumphs of women working in television in the 1970s suggest that, quite simply, the television workplace operated as a site for feminist gains. As such, I think it warrants further consideration as we as feminist scholars reconstructed what was hoped for and what was gained as well as lost for feminism in the 70s and where we might locate its expression. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Okay, finally we have Helen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up, I think, on some of the themes that were discussed in the last paper, particularly towards the end, the importance of the women's experience in the creative industry. So that was, while I'm sad Shelley's not here, that's fortunate. So this paper it forms part of a broader research project on costume design as a gendered form of creative labour. And though it's in its infancy, the project seeks to make visible the experience of practitioners working in the area of film and in an area of film and television production that is typically dominated by women. These experiences have often been written out of histories of media production, and despite the fact that they can advance our understanding of the cultural and creative industries in meaningful ways. In particular, they have much to tell us about the persistent inequalities within the field, which, as Connor, Jill and Taylor explained, have historically been inefficiently explored. This has in part to do with the difficulties in data collection. For example, debates continue over precisely what counts as creative in discussions of creative labour, which of course bears significance for quantitative research, i.e. decisions about what to include or what to exclude, skews certain data and makes it difficult to draw comparisons. But also much of the qualitative empirical data has so far relied almost exclusively upon the testimonies of men and often in senior positions. Thus, as feminist scholars including Miranda Banks, Deborah Jones and Judith Pringle argue, documenting and interrogating the experiences of women in below-the-line professions provide an important counter-narrative to this research. And in this paper, I want to explore the ways in which women practitioners collectively imagine and make sense of their creative labour and corresponding status or lack thereof. And I seek to expand on John Caldwell's concept of trade genres and examine the ways in which the stories told by women practitioners and made public in trade papers complicate Caldwell's implicitly masculine typology. In so doing, I argue that these trade genres require revision and reimagining in order to capture the lived experience of those working in feminine professions. In addition, this paper interrogates the ways in which these new trade genres this paper interrogates these new trade genres in order to make clear the ways in which the stories told often serve to explain away complex power relations and structural disadvantages that continue to delegitimise and devalue women's creative labour. Now, the material gathered within this paper is taken from the Costume Designers Guild, hereafter CDG, official publication, the Costume Designer magazine. The magazine was first published in 2005, in autumn 2005, and it's interesting because it provides a unique insight into the costume design community, whilst also contributing to the construction of costume designers' professional identities. As a publication associated with the CDG, it shares the organisation's mission, which is precisely to raise the stature of costume design as a profession within the entertainment community, to ensure that it reflects the contribution that costume designers make to motion pictures, television and commercials. And in so doing, both the CDG and the accompanying magazine make a strong case for costume design to be considered creative work, despite the fact that it's often considered a below-the-line profession and therefore, by default, not creative. On their official website, the CDG seeks to define the costume design in these terms, precisely in creative terms. It first acknowledges that for many perhaps may have no understanding of precisely what the role involves. And it says, what does a costume designer do? And then goes on to write that you might be one, that a costume designer transforms the world of the script, the words of the script, into visual imagery and creates the look of a character. Costume design helps to create believable characters and support the story, support the narrative in a fictional universe. In other words, costume design is storytelling. And then it goes on to describe the product of costume design as art, as something and craft. So the costume designer produces art and is placed alongside the screenwriter in terms of their importance in telling stories. Yet their status is not comparable, despite the work of the CDG in lobbying for recognition. As below-the-line workers, costume designers experience the creative industry in markedly different ways. So, in production cultures, Caldwell examines the cultural function of trade stories and begins to conceptualise popular trade narratives into different genres, as you can see here. And these include war stories, against all odds, allegories, Genesis myths, past not taken parables, make-believe sagas, and cautionary tales. And they're further categorised by context of work sectors, insofar as he suggests that genres are specific to profession. He proposes that above-the-line workers are more likely to employ Genesis myths and past not taken parables, whereas below-the-line staff tend to recount war stories and against all odds allegories in order to make sense of their role. The cultural functions of these trade stories include establishing craft mastery and labour mystique, and showcase a specific skill set, which is certitude, physique, and belief. War stories, as the title suggests, construct production as a form of war. Battles are won on account of individual heroism performed by below-the-line practitioners, which demonstrate moral character and triumph of will. Caldwell's concept of war stories, then, are profoundly masculinised. The specific examples which he draws, upon which he draws even place a premium on masculine characteristics such as physical strength. Thus, the costume designer, a typically below-the-line but feminised figure, does not employ war stories in quite the same way. Rather, tales of battle recounted within the Costume Designer magazine often involve subtly managing above-the-line individuals or external powerful forces in an attempt to protect the cultural legitimacy of the project, which thematically echoes the familiar axiom that behind every great man is a great woman. The success of these wars is won on the ability to exercise self-sacrificing restraint and humility. And there are loads of examples of this throughout the Costume Designer magazine. There's often talk of the difficulties costume designers have in managing above-the-line professionals. So there's stories of the costume designer for Mamma Mia, Anne Roth, reveals that her biggest challenge was trying to get Colin Firth to wear a pair of pink trousers. And similarly, Jacqueline West, who's a costume designer for The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, recalls the difficulties in getting a red dress approved by director David Fincher because, and I quote, David Fincher doesn't like red. I don't know why. Elaborating on these difficulties, costume designer Ariane Phillips in the summer 2010 issue writes that one of the hardest jobs for the costume designer working on contemporary films so one of the hardest jobs is working on contemporary film because all of the people making decisions about these costumes are above the line. Producers, directors, actors. All these people can afford to buy product. They have access to high fashion, which makes people feel like they're experts. So despite the fact that costume designers themselves consider themselves experts and have expertise in this area, they have to answer to these above-the-line professionals who, because of their privilege, seem to seem to think that they can have final say, despite the fact that it's not, their job. So against all odds allegories operate in the same way. As with war stories, against all odds allegories, as defined by Caldwell, often employ myths of classic heroism designed to associate below-the-line staff with a specific set of masculine characteristics, which are physical perseverance and tenacity. Once more, it's clear that the costume designer fails to fall neatly into these categories, not simply because of the gendered nature of the role, but also because of the strange liminal position that the costume designer has, in the sense that they function as creative workers, i.e. they contribute to the symbolic aspects of the project, but they're denied the status and the monetary gain associated, according to above-the-line personnel. Nevertheless, certain aspects of against all odds allegories are employed with regularity, specifically the premise that low budgets are the mother of invention. Details of difficult working conditions are central to the professional identity of the costume designer and serve to foreground the level of creativity and ingenuity the role requires. Veteran costume designer Ruth Myers writes in the spring of 2006 issue that she still has enormous passion for what she does, but, and I quote, at times the pressure of budgets, less prep time and answering to a studio as opposed to a director can compromise a designer's freedom. Similarly, Isis Mussenden, who was costume designer for the Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian, she recalls the difficulty in or the demands made on her when she was attempting to access 300 suits of armour, but the people making them didn't speak any English at all. So there's lots of stories about the struggles, the very kind of the day-to-day struggles, but also kind of significant issues in terms of budget, time, and demands made upon costume designers within the creative industries. These trade stories ultimately play an important function in establishing craft and mastery, and often via moral character and triumph of will. Establishing craft and mastery is particularly important in early issues of the trade paper, as it's precisely in this period in the 2000s where the legitimacy of costume design is most in question, following the increasing use of designer fashion on screen. Consequently, within the trade press, fashions and fashion designers are often posed as a threat to the cultural legitimacy of costume designers. And implicitly, this speaks to a persistent hierarchy in which the work of fashion designers is valued above costumers, a hierarchy which the costume designers' trade stories seek to dismantle or at least problematise. In her president's letter in the spring 2005 issue, costume designer Deborah Landis boldly claims that, and I quote, fashion can kill characters, a sentiment echoed throughout a number of the issues, during which costumers recount their troubling experiences with studios who wish to bring in fashion houses in an attempt to either save on budget or create some kind of deal and ultimately make a profit. This often leads to costume designers favouring period pieces, as they feel, to quote Phillips, these projects often seem more, and I quote, pure and unfettered. So it's assumed that fashion will overtake the project and disrupt storytelling, whereas costume is designed to be kind of unremarkable, or at least the work of the costumer is designed to remain hidden. Their work, in fact, is actually attributed in order for them to fulfill their role as storytellers. Their work has to be hidden. It has to be attributed to the characters within the world of the film. So they're denied the agency on kind of both levels. If the clothes are recognised, it's because of the fashion designers. If they're not recognised, it's because of the characters. So they kind of, arguably because of their storytelling duties, have to render their own work invisible. But this, I would argue, has implications for the way in which their work is then valued by the industry. So in a particularly interesting issue in spring 2008, the magazine focuses specifically on costume designer Marlena Stewart. And in the editor's letter, Dina Apple remarks that while the magazine has avoided shining the spotlight on one designer, as they're a guild of peers and the magazine should reflect this, Stewart was deserving of the attention because she never seeks publicity. And that's a quote. She says, they explicitly mention the fact that she shies away from publicity and therefore is entitled to it. Because she's celebrated for this. She's celebrated for her selflessness. And in particular, she's commented, she's celebrated for supporting other costume designers and working collaboratively with assistants. And when in the interview, when they talk about this, she says, she acknowledges that she does this, but she says, I suppose the only trait that I'm uncomfortable with is if an assistant is overly ambitious and uses the project to promote themselves, suggesting that those who use the project for individual recognition kind of lack integrity, and those who refuse to render their work invisible, they're a kind of problem. And so I think this is a really interesting remark because it calls attention to and implicitly critiques the increasing premium placed on self-promotion within the creative industries. And there's a great deal of anxiety surrounding the need to promote oneself in the magazine, which has been highlighted by scholars as a barrier to women's success in creative industries. It's assumed that men are more comfortable with this kind of self-promotion and are ultimately rewarded for it. However, there's a sense in the magazine that self-promotion it's actually kind of the antithesis of what the costume designer should do, because they should render themselves and their work invisible. To promote themselves somehow detracts from their ability to do their work. And so the magazine has this really interesting discourse where, on the one hand, it attempts to kind of provide a support network for costume designers and ensure that they they do get recognition. On the other hand, it also suggests that there's something problematic about promoting the self. So these kinds of anecdotes, foreground the moral character of the costume designer in the same way that masculine war stories do. However, the role of the costume designer often involves willfully sacrificing authorship and any potential economic gain that the costumer may have if some of their designs then consequently spark fashion trends. They're supposed to again deny their role within this. And they do this in order for the greater good of the project, which in itself is a heavily gendered concept. Thus, the costume designer's humility is central to several of the trade stories throughout the entire magazine. And throughout the magazine, the costume designers deny their own needs in order to help above-the-line professionals as well realise their vision. So the language used to describe the role is often as a kind of support system. That term is thrown about a lot throughout the issues, that they are a support system for the narrative, and echoes the way in which domestic forms of feminine labour are often talked about as kind of being invisible and behind the scenes, that support the masculine public labour of above-the-line professionals. And this is really interestingly even reflected in the kind of advertising that makes the magazine possible. Now, I was really interested in this particular advert precisely because it struck me that it had the position, that it has the position in the magazine in the first place, suggesting that this is a magazine for women. This is the role of the costume designer is gendered and it is for women, but also the kind of rhetoric that it uses in the sense that carefree spotlight stealing confidence for her with behind-the-scenes protection. So it's all about supporting the above-the-line stuff with your, the costume designers being the behind the scenes protection. They're not meant to be seen. They are basically the sanitary towel of the creative industries. I was trying to avoid saying that, but I was like, I don't know anything else. Kind of in the sense that their work is invisible and important and a support system, but they absolutely should not be, made visible. Anyway, that was weird. Right. So yeah. And interestingly, the magazine was only I've got a paragraph. The magazine was only it only was published in 2005 as a result of the advertising revenue that it could secure through adverts like this. I thought it was really interesting. Anyway, but it's this willingness to sacrifice oneself for the creative project that protects the legitimacy of costume design, a profession that requires a set of feminine, domestic and thereby devalued skill set that becomes essential to the trade stories that the costume designers tell. And in closing, I just want to reiterate the importance of these trade stories and argue for their importance in feminist production studies. And while we must endeavour to be critical of their function and expose the way in which they may, and sometimes do, justify poor working conditions and pay conditions, they also draw attention to and critique the problematic masculine nature of creative work. And consequently, we must recognise the importance of sharing these stories and ensure, as the CDG do, that they are heard, documented and taken seriously.
Well, maybe perhaps we could put Crystal back on the as much as I have loved. And if we could have the presenters come.
Okay.
Hey.
There we go.
So we've got a good, I think, 15, 20? What do you think, Tristan?
10, more like between
10?
10 and 15.
Okay.
I saw the lunch pulling up,
Okay,
so.
well then 10. So 10 minutes for some conversation, and I think while all of the papers were quite different, they have a lot of overlaps in interesting ways. So does anyone want to kick it off, or shall I start? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my question's for Helen. That was such an interesting paper, especially in terms of sort of constructing authorship in creative industries, etc. But the aspect that I was really interested in is the kind of potential it has to, sort of maybe delineate conversations about creativity or authorship in such industries and kind of question it. Could you tell me a bit more about your work that probably kind of feeds into that, rather than kind of giving authorship or acknowledging the authorship of certain individuals behind the cameras or behind the scenes, for their work to kind of be a potential to then sort of question the authorship of above the line professionals or the auteur.
So how below the line workers may kind of problematise the idea of the auteur and the creative genius that you kind of often attribute to. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that one of the reasons that I focus on costume design particularly is because I think it's one of that and makeup kind of arguably in tandem and there's another kind of trade magazine for workers in the makeup department as well, which I think would be interesting to look at as a kind of to see whether the same kinds of trade stories are told. But I think the function, the reason that costume design to me is particularly interesting is precisely because it can make a claim to be creative, to be kind of a really important part of the filmmaking and project, but it isn't considered above the line, and oddly production design often is. So it's like if you can make furniture, then you can get more money, but if you sew, which is kind of that gender, and I struggle to see kind of why those two things are different. So it's interesting that I think it may be one of a few below the line professions that is able to do that is able to kind of critique and question the authorship of those in above the line professions, and it does, and that's what some of the interesting things about the trade stories do. It says they struggle to balance this really fine line between recognising that their job is a kind of support system, but at the same time there's a great deal of anger kind of and disappointment with a lot of above the line professionals who seek to kind of override some of their decisions, whereas they would argue that's the job that they've been brought to do.
Sorry, just to clarify the question, I mean, I guess I'm looking at it as, by claiming more of an authorship role, would that de-radicalize their job as, the potential to kind of see authorship itself as kind of, made by a group of people, and the work itself to be made by a group of people rather than one author or one creative genius?
Yeah, I think so, and I think it absolutely does. And one of the really interesting things, because obviously a lot of the stuff that's written about creative labour talks about it as being a very individual thing, which is why a lot of inequalities persist, because it's very difficult to talk about it kind of
without talking about representation.
Absolutely, yeah. Whereas one of the interesting things about this particular trade paper is the role that it has in creating this community and creating this collective. So I think it would. I think you're absolutely right.
Those were all so interesting. I have so many questions, but I just wanted to ask Crystal something. You were talking before about micro-celebrities and one element of their labour is the labour of kind of believability. I think you mentioned this term believability, which I thought was really interesting, because it seemed to me perhaps connected to discourses of authenticity in relation to online celebrity. I'm just thinking, I've done a little bit of stuff on YouTube, celebrities in the UK, where often it seems like they're getting more well known, and of course then they get more kinds of endorsement and sponsorship deals, but they seem to have to be very careful in relation to how they package themselves in relation to those, in relation to particular brands they might be building relationships or endorsement deals with. So I guess I wondered, for the micro celebrities you were looking at, is believability the same thing as authenticity? I.e., do they have to be careful, and do their fans kind of help to police them in relation to what kinds of deals and endorsement deals they have, how they then represent those to their fans? I guess if you could just unpick this term believability a little more, because it seems really fascinating.
Okay, so there's several interrelated concepts, but I'm not going to explain them, I just want to distinguish them. There's the concept of relatability, which is how well their fans think they can fit into the shoes of these women.
Yeah.
So for this reason, it's important for them to look pretty in makeup and dress well, but also show you, oh my god, I've got a pimple, or I put on weight, or I've got to a quarrel with my boyfriend, or I do chores, because that makes them a real person.
Yeah.
And visualizing this behind the scenes also gives them that intimacy and that accessibility, as if they're not just showing you the front stage, but they're showing you the backstage. So believability comes in here when the supposed backstage they show their readers is actually still performed and still staged. It's more curated, but it's curated to look careless, to look like I just got out of bed and I look like this. So it's selectively revealing things that may sometimes not be congruent with their professional persona. It looks very glamorous and high fashion, but it's meant to make them look more like a human person. So whatever they market to their fans is something they can emulate after and consume in order to look like that. Because no one looks like Angelina Jolie and think, if I buy that, I'm going to look like her. But if they look at these micro celebrities, they're the intermediaries that feel more accessible to the readers.
Yeah. Thanks, that's great.
Yeah, I would just like tag on to that question. I think we can maybe even expand this question about authenticity to cover, I feel like it comes up in all three papers in different ways, but as attached to affect, I think is a really kind of interesting angle on this question. So the way that I kind of saw it playing through all papers was in Crystal's talk, thinking about when you were talking about girl talk and how the micro celebrities perform this sort of really familiar and intimate kind of chatter with their fans as a kind of affective way of managing authenticity in that sense, like becoming that sort of relatable and believable character. And then in Jennifer's paper, I think it's a completely different kind of context in which the affective authenticity there has more to do with, as I kind of read it, a kind of feminist politics, and that being at the forefront of women's mobility in this industry. And then finally, in Helen's paper, the affect is humility, like you were just mentioning with that quote, where it's seen as sort of in a contradictory way that you shouldn't really be self-promoting yourself, even though you should somehow, within the guild, be trying to improve the status of costume design. So I don't know if any of you want to tackle this kind of affect question about how authenticity kind of plays out in these professional imaginaries.
It seems to me like part of, in the context that I'm coming out of, there seems to be, I'm tempted to say that it's less calculated maybe, in the sense that there was no real template, and it didn't seem to be that there was a real understanding that this could be parlayed beyond, like feminist politics could be parlayed beyond this one moment in time or whatever. I mean, although it did, it almost feels like it's accidental, and these women sort of picked up skills and abilities in spite of the sexist practices of the industry. So they're sort of in a peculiar position in that they sort of kind of happen into things at certain points, and they themselves talk about it. So it's a kind of an odd idea that they're both feminists and they're very proactive and engaged in the production that they're doing, but the reason that they got there is through this kind of like limitation that they're always facing. And so the fact that, you know, for instance, Virginia Carter gets hired to be sort of a cog in the factory at Lear Productions was just because she sort of was a feminist and was in Los Angeles and was sort of speaking out very publicly. She had no intention of working in television, and so I find that kind of odd path of, you know, she's not a celebrity, she's not trained in the world of television production. So I think that the feminist politics is an important affect that gets sort of utilized once it gets put in place, but I don't know that it's sort of quite as strategic maybe as the other two examples. Probably the most affective part of the women that I'm speaking to is frustration and anger. You know, that they're just like, you know, that their show gets canceled and no one bothers to tell them. And they just show up and then they go on the Tonight Show and like outrage the censors because then they flip people off, you know. And so I think that's an interest, and that hasn't something I've been really exploring. I'm just thinking about kind of the nuts and bolts of how you get from point A to point B in an industry that doesn't always welcome you. I haven't really thought about that, but I do think kind of anger and feminist rage is probably something to explore, and they kind of fueled them in a lot of really creative and interesting ways. So
I think connecting to what you were just saying, there's a similar kind of rage and frustration within the costume design community, but it is tempered with this also frustration of having to play the creative industry in using the masculine kind of rules, if that makes sense. Because it just reminded me of one kind of really interesting, one of the things I find most interesting in the magazine is the editor's notes and how they kind of respond to various things that happened in previous issues, and there's some kind of communication there. And there's in one particular issue, they talk about the importance of putting actual labels in costume. They're saying, like, are you using your labels? We've told you, you know, kind of everybody use your labels. And then in one editor's note it says, we've had a lot of talk about how you don't feel comfortable putting labels on your clothes because, you know, sometimes you may have bought something but you made it green instead of blue and you cut the sleeves off and you don't really feel like you can take ownership of that. You can't really take ownership of that. And while we understand that, you know, kind of really encourage you to use labels. And then there's, interestingly, then the next issue, there's one of the few articles that's the contributors are almost exclusively women, except kind of one article which is precisely about branding oneself online, and it's this step by step about how important self-promotion is and how you can do it, and how you can create a profile, and how you can make sure that all of your work is seen in the way that you want it. And then again, afterwards in the editor's note, there's some kind of rebellion that they're not interested, you know, costume designers as a community are not interested in playing by these rules, and there is the same kind of frustration at being forced to promote themselves using tools that they don't feel comfortable with and that are typically masculine.
Probably have time for about one more question. Sorry. Yes.
I just wanted to ask, I guess, because of that, I'll try to articulate this better. I thought it was very interesting that it seems that the majority of feelings that come from the two papers that we're talking about, which is much more institutionalized within the concept of film or TV shows, or in your case, television production, seems to have a lot of that affect from the women that are working, being anger, like you're saying, or frustration for both of you, or in your case, there seems to be a rebellion even against how to present one as like a self-made woman that is drawing profit from that kind of creative labor. But then Crystal's, for what I gathered, is the opposite almost. It seems to be a lot of this self-promotion. You seem to want to promote, when you are one of these micro-celebrities, glamour, happiness, girlishness. And I think I kind of wanted just to hear a little bit about that. Why is it's also somehow outside, at least presented as outside institutional, because they're kind of creating themselves and presenting themselves in a space that is the web, which means they can have more leeway than when you're working at a job within an institution, so to speak. So I was just curious, I guess, it's not a very well formulated question, but I was just curious about affect, if the affect in this kind of a blog or cyberspace, that it is actually happier because it's free from those constraints of the institution, or if it has actually just performed as such to attract a different kind of audience, if it is part of its job, so to speak, to seem not angry, not frustrated, not engaging in these kinds of labor politics that when you are employed in a job, you actually have to engage with, like your show getting canceled and nobody shows you respect to tell you so. So I think I just wanted to talk about that, or wanted you to talk about that, Crystal. And the two of you too, if you want to jump in and say something.
I think I don't use the word authenticity at all in my work because it's not productive for the group I study. The viewers are very critical and very aware that it's all a performance. Even if I show you I woke up like this, clearly I got out of bed, made myself look pretty, put on concealer, they got back into bed and then took a selfie. So they're very critical and they know that everything is staged, even if it's the backstage, even when they show intimacy. But the crux here is how well you can perform this so that your readers feel relatable, feel that it's believable, and feel that it's intimate. So authenticity really doesn't come up in the vernacular at all, and no one really minds if that breakup you talked about never really happened, as long as you're able to shape some sort of emotion and sentiment out of your audience or has a specific purpose. And again, things like feeling angry, feeling sadness, it's always marketed and branded and put out there for some productive end. So I may play up my anger on the social media platform as a way to get hype or stir controversy or to direct traffic to my feeds. But in other senses, when it's not productive, I may hide it and feel it as a form of backstage affect, not emotional labor, so it can't be commercialized, it can't be monetized. So for these women, I think affect is really something they feel that they do not use to make money out of, but once they put it out there and make it visible, that's when it becomes Who's Child's notion of emotional labor with use value and monetary value. I hope I answered your question.
Well, that's great, thank you. On that kind of cynical note, thank you so much to all of the panelists. I think that was a really interesting set of papers, and hopefully we can kind of continue talking about this at lunch. That being said, I think lunch has arrived.
Lunch has arrived, yeah, it's out on the mezzanine.
So thanks everyone.